My name is Kathleen Barrow, and I am the convener of this group. This is the ACRL CLS Leadership and Management Issues in College Libraries Discussion Group. Sorry, it's a huge long name. This is our first ever online discussion, so we appreciate any feedback at the end. We are hoping to get a wider audience this way, so we are trying this out. I also want to thank Debbie Andregis from Denison University and Sam Boss, who's one of our speakers today from Northern Vermont University, for their help in putting this whole day together. And also thank you for our three panelists today. So our format is our three panelists will each speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then we'll take questions at the end. So if you have questions that come up, please stick them in the chat. I will do my best to monitor the chat and take those questions down and ask them at the end. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist. Our first panelist is Andrew Whitis. He is the University Librarian and College Librarian for Business at the University of Findlay. And he is going to talk about a change will do you good.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear me now. And yes, thank you for that introduction. I've been an academic librarian now for 15 years. I've been at the University of Findlay for about 6.5 as the university librarian. Prior to this, I was at Defiance College, which is also in Northwest Ohio, as library director. I was there for about 4.5 years. And prior to that, at Muskingum University in Southeast Ohio. So you can get a sense for where I'm going. I've been an Ohio academic librarian a lot, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is situated, or at least based in, that we're all Ohio Link members, so a lot of the changes we were able to make was related to, again, maybe access to content or what kind of content we had in our collection is predicated on the fact of Ohio Link membership, which your mileage may vary depending on your consortial relationship. Prior to becoming an academic librarian, I worked in corporate America. I actually was working for Deloitte at the time, called Deloitte & Touche in Pittsburgh, for about 7 years in their knowledge management and business development practice in Pittsburgh. So another disclaimer before I get too far in this too, all the institutions I've been working for are primarily teaching institutions. So I realize that in an academic setting, you know, if you're at a larger institution that has a heavy research focus, some of the things I'm going to talk about may not be applicable, and hopefully you'll still get something out of that and can actually, you know, do something if it makes sense for your institution. So when I started out as an academic library director, I was fortunate enough to participate in the ACRL College Library Director Mentor Program, which actually helped provide some of the foundation for the changes I was able to make at both Defiance and at Findlay. And I also attended the Council on Library and Information Resources, CLEAR, and the Council of Independent Colleges, CIC, had a joint conference back in 2010 on, let's see, what was the title exactly? College Restructuring in the Library Workshop, which again focused on restructuring workflows. That was the whole purpose of this. So I've been fortunate for both institutions where I've been an administrator to have a very supportive Provost VPAA. So right from the get-go, I've had an administration who has identified as part of the, at least during the hiring process, that they were looking for modifications to the library. Either the faculty or perhaps even students had commented, you know, that maybe the library needed to be improved both in the types of services or maybe in the type of resources available or even in maybe the look of the library itself. And in both institutions, there was a physical renovation to existing space components. So a lot of the change that I've been involved in looking at workflow changes has also been driven by the need to make physical changes to the building, not so much actually add an addition as much as a renovation to an existing space. So when I started at both institutions, the first thing I like to do is to actually get to know the staff. And again, you know, when the title I gave with this, "A Change Will Do You Good," and I hopefully you know, Cheryl Crow's not upset about that, is the idea that, you know, sometimes people get very focused in how they're doing something, and sometimes it's good to look at, you know, is there an opportunity to perhaps make a change for the better to deliver a better service? So sitting down, talking to staff, trying to get a feel for what they like about their jobs, what they don't like about their jobs, what they like about the library, what they don't like about the library, at least starts that conversation that, there's an opportunity to perhaps do something a little bit different. Along with that, though, and again, if you're doing like a long-term change, oftentimes you need to set the stage or a vision for what you're looking to do. And in both institutions, there was the opportunity to talk about, okay, we had a very definitive project. We were trying to develop some kind of a learning commons in our library that would involve additional staff and probably make physical changes to where collections are located. And we're probably gonna have to make some physical or modifications to how we were doing processes. So setting that vision first with staff kind of help, again, to set the stage for the change that eventually would come. And then again, leading more into that is then sitting down with staff and having more in-depth conversations about the types of changes needed, getting their ideas about what they might like to see changed, and how they might actually want to implement that change. So, and oftentimes you find these interesting things. So I use the phrase zombie processes. You may have these actually running in your library still today. And again, your mileage may vary on if it's a zombie process for you or not. But as a very, I guess, concrete example. So at Findlay, the acquisitions person had been in the role for about a year, and she had not done a lot of work in acquisitions prior to this. She had primarily been working with print subscriptions and also media in all formats, but not so much all acquisitions across the board. So she hadn't really dug down into standing orders. That's the zombie process I'm talking about. So, and I kind of discovered this too at Defiance, that sometimes libraries start collecting things and they actually create a standing order for something. And again, at a teaching institution, things change. And if you don't go back and look at those, you might still be receiving resources, spending money on things that aren't necessarily relevant to the curriculum being taught. At Findlay, we were receiving a number of print resources, some monographic series, some reference sets on Shakespeare, because at a point in time, we had an English faculty member who was very much into Shakespeare, had taught, and basically asked the library to start collecting this, was really teaching a lot of courses, but now there's only one course taught in Shakespeare, at least at our institution. So that was an opportunity to perhaps reduce some money out of the budget, going to one resource not getting used that could be redirected to something else to benefit students, and also could save some time for our not only our acquisitions person, but our cataloger would no longer have to work with those materials. Another example is looking at workflows for physical processing. And again, this might be, you might have already done this, but at both institutions, it was interesting to sit down with both cataloging, acquisition staff, as well as circulation staff to talk about exactly the workflow of when a physical item comes into the library and what steps it actually goes through to get on a shelf, and identifying steps that may no longer need to be made. For example, how many times you actually have to stamp a book with property marks? Do you still need to put a date due slip in the back of a book if you no longer stamp date dues because it's being emailed? And again, in a consortial environment, sometimes you still need that, sometimes you don't. Again, mileage may vary. But having these conversations, staff often identify, oh, that's a really great idea. I never thought of that. And I can actually, this is something we could get rid of, and I could actually use that time to do something else. So again, not always will staff immediately jump on that, and sometimes as a manager, as a leader, you actually have to provide a little gentler pressure and perhaps a little bit encouragement. But I found that again, if by setting a vision, showing examples of what something might be like, taking staff to another library that's implemented some kind of change, or even having library staff talk to peers in another library that have gone through a similar change, can kind of ease that concern about change, because again, acknowledging that change is difficult, and then allowing the staff person or the librarian to implement the change the way they want to, again, ensuring though that it actually delivers the results you're looking for, has kind of been, kind of the way that I've done it at both institutions, and it seems to work out. I have run into a couple situations where I've asked, and again, mileage may vary at your institution, I've asked a librarian to start a change process, And sometimes that's run into some pushback with staff. And again, when I make a distinction between librarians having a degree, the master's degree, and staff who do not. So I ran into that when I was at Defiance. So at Findlay, I intentionally asked staff to take the lead on some of these projects. And I think that actually helped a little bit, perhaps buy-in go a little bit quicker. Still, every now and then I still get a little pushback on things, and it's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I do actually like when staff come back and challenge and say, well, why are we thinking about this? But I always take the conversation back to, well, the intent of making a change is to improve service to a student or a faculty member. And, you know, are we doing this in a way that's going to improve our students' learning, or have, you know, provide access to our faculty members to a resource better? And sometimes the staff or librarian will come back and say, well, I disagree because, and I'll say, you're right. So I think it's also good to often, again, even though I may have a very laser focus on the end goal, to have the ability to allow some changes, again, in what we're doing based on what staff have said. So the one thing I will say, if you do want a book recommendation, Switch, How to Change Things and When Change is Hard by Chip and Dan Heath. You might have read this book already, or not. It came out in 2010, but this is a very, I think, accessible book to talk about change in a variety of ways. If you really want to go hardcore into change, of course, and I know we're not book talking, but of course, John Cotter wrote the Leading Change book, which is kind of this is kind of the big change management book that's out there. So a couple things at least to think about from the perspective of, you know, staff looking at workflows. Set the vision for what the change is, encourage the staff to take ownership in making that change, applying gentle pressure and encouragement, and just kind of, again, coming to an agreement on if there is a disagreement, then okay, this is a good compromise. We may not get to the full change, but we're going to get there at some point. And I think it's been successful in both institutions. And I think, again, we've seen students who are happier with our services. We've seen faculty which are happier with changes they've seen in the library. And I think the library staff feel better about what they're doing because I think they feel more ownership in being involved in making that change. So that's been my experience, and again, making some workflow changes in the library.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you should copyright that term, zombie processes, because I have seen many zombie processes in my own library, and a lot of other stuff that I can relate to. On a personal note, I have to say that Andrew let me visit him when I was appointed interim librarian in my current position, and was really the person that showed me, like, you can make this change and not make everyone mad at you. So thank you, Andrew. Next up is Amy. I'm going to mispronounce your name, Amy, even though you gave me this way to say that. Bodicher, am I right?
You did it perfectly.
Amy is the Associate Vice President for Library and Information Services and Library Director at Kenyon College. And her talk is going to be about time for a new library building, leading, managing change during physical transition chaos. And I think she's in a temporary place right now. Yeah, we'll talk more about that in a minute.
This is our temporary building. I'm going to share some slides just to give you a little bit of a sense of idea. I hadn't really planned to talk a lot about my background, but when Andrew was talking about his, I noticed that before I came here, I worked for McKinsey & Company, a management consulting firm that would have been a competitor to Deloitte Touche, where Andrew worked. So, you know, I think the question that people ask is, you know, why are you getting a new library building? There's really nothing wrong with your buildings. Well, actually now they are, because they're in a dump heap over there. But we had a $75 million anonymous donation for a new library. And, you know, the changing use of technology in the curriculum is something that we were not keeping up with. And libraries are always transforming. A new building is designed for today, tomorrow, and beyond. And so when your buildings are, you know, 50, and I think the other one was, you know, 25 years old, it starts to, you know, you start to feel that the age of the buildings. So what I'm going to focus on here, and this is just a little peek into what the new library will look like. And yes, that is a beautiful, huge sculpture down there. I don't know if you can see where my pointer is, but down here on the bottom, that's a sculpture that will be in the new building. But my focus will be mostly on the moving out to the temporary spaces, and where are library services and people if the building doesn't exist? This was the question the staff was like struggling with, like how are we going to work with this with no building? What does that mean for us? What do we do? How do we run services? What about student study spaces? We even have some faculty who are still saying, so when's the auditorium going to reopen? Well, it's not, it's gone. It's going away, it's gone. So we're a merged library IT organization. So within the library building itself, we had, the library services, access, collection, reference, but we also had information technology services, our user services folks, institutional research, and other groups that were in the building. And so we had to account for all these different people and figuring out how to get them all out, how to get everyone thinking about new spaces. So, you had the library planning committee that was mostly focused on the new building, but did some of the work on planning to get out, planning for temporary spaces and things. We had the internal logistics team that was for years, because we knew this building was coming, for years trying to figure out what do we need to do? What are the services we need to offer? And we'd get different people involved at different times. And years, I mean like 2 years, not decades. And then the departmental teams, everyone would start to work, once they said, all right, this is what's going to happen next, down to the level of detail. But, we had to create new patterns and new workflows in these temporary spaces. And so to give you a little peek on what that looked like and how some of that went about, we created this team. We visited lots of other libraries. We went out in the field. We talked to people. We worked with designers. We had to build an entire storage building for our collection. So we had to work with shelvers and, when we first started talking about this, we were looking at a 30,000 square foot, big, huge warehouse space. And then they finally came back and said, well, you can only get 20,000 square feet. So we had to go higher. So our shelves in our storage building are 12 feet high. I mean, it's a gorgeous space, but I mean, it's intimidating when you come in. We measured and measured and measured. We inventoried everything. And you can just imagine that while you're going through this, we're still doing all of our services. Everyone's still doing classroom instruction. Books are still being checked out. Everything's still working, right? And so, you're sort of doing all of this at the same time as nothing stops in a college, right? So we were ready to move out basically as soon as classes ended last spring. So, I mean, that was the goal, right? To be ready. And so reimagining workflows, as Andrew was just talking a little bit about it, sort of the nitty gritty of, technical services and access services and things like that. Well, just imagine trying to reimagine how you gain access to your collection. So we needed help from our consortial partners to do this too. And I know some of them are on the list over there, like Denison. So this is just a sort of an overview, and you can see those purple boxes. I'm in the first purple box from the middle path right now, right here in this corner. That's where I'm sitting talking to you from. But those were what we had these are where your temporary spaces, and this Olin and Chalmers Library is what we were in before. So you can imagine these spaces are much smaller than what we were in. I'm trying to keep track of time here. Kathleen, Neela, let me know if I get too tight. So we had to recreate all of this. And so this is one that our special collections and archives worked in. And you can see that their collection is not here. It's down in the storage building. This is our where we put in our classroom and a conference room and all of our work offices. And this big one in the middle is where the reference went and circulation and everything else. So, you can just imagine trying to take all of your services and squish them down into a little tiny box and make it work. And so just a quick glance, here are some of the pictures. And it did turn out. I mean, this is the classroom. These are some of the study spaces in the back, the circ desk. I mean, it turned out pretty good considering. But as you can imagine, the biggest impact was on access to the collection. So our circulation and access services folks had to work with our consortial partners to be able to request books from Kenyon. It's not something we could do before, so we had to be able to get a request from Kenyon button. So now it's like any other, Ohio Link situation where you can just request a book from Kenyon and we bring it up to you. It's the same thing. The biggest challenge we've had, well, we've had a lot of challenges with student drivers. And this morning as I came in and the streets are iced over, the local schools are closed, and I watched 2 students get in the van to drive off to go get the books, and I'm incredibly nervous. Like, I hope they've salted down by the storage building, because I don't want to find out that, you know, anything happened. I've heard nothing, so I'm sure it was all fine. But, you know, you have student drivers, and you don't always know. They have to go down and get things off these 12-foot shelves. And so that was a big workflow change, and it took a lot of time. And I think one of the things I learned there was that, you know, you can't answer all the questions until you get into some of those spaces. You know, we're in 5 different buildings. The student study spaces are even in more spaces than that. I think 7 or 8 different spaces. We're still opening some right now. Spent the morning and yesterday working on 2 new spaces that are coming online. So I think all of those kinds of changes took a lot of time and patience for everyone, you know, when you're trying to think through things. And some of the extreme changes, again, were, you know, the special collections and archives. In the past, their collection was right with them in their space. And now they have to think before, you know, if someone comes in, you can't just go in the back room and pull out the stuff. You have to plan ahead. So those kinds of changes. And I think they're still struggling with that a little bit. You know, they have more closed time, and the student workers are doing different things. So I think, you know, we're still sort of dealing with that. I mean, we've been in these spaces essentially since June when we moved in, and you know, we've extended, you know, for the students, it's a lot of hassle. There's a lot of mapping, and where do I go, and where is this thing, and, you know, even now I get people who stop in my office and say, hey, where's the help desk, you know, which is in the building next door. And it's weird to sort of say, oh, you just passed it, but you actually have to go back outside and go next door. So a lot of those things, you know, changing the hours of for students to borrow laptops, because it's not like, you know, they're right next door to return things. So those are some of the extreme changes. And then I had doubled my slides. Sorry about that. I must have gone back. Anyway, you know, it's sort of along the way, the takeaways for me were, you know, often to step away from the weeds, because sometimes we'd get down to a point where people would be asking you questions, and I'm like, I can't answer that yet, because we haven't, you know, point A, B, and C, we haven't gotten to a place where that's an answerable question. You can't know everything at once. Involve everyone. You know, in a project like this, you know, you're literally moving 55 people out of a building and all of the furniture. We inventoried everything, we measured everything, as I said before. So it's that one step at a time, and be prepared to make adjustments. And I put down here daily, hourly, often, because like you just never know in the plan, like, oh, that's not going to work. You know, we worked with movers and we worked with book movers, and, you know, there was just so many levels of detail. So you had to trust that everyone would step on board and move forward. And for me, and some of those who are on this call know that I got very sick during the middle of this project. And so everyone had to step up and take on a different role in some ways. And so it was amazing to see how that all come together, and it worked out really nicely. So I'm really proud of my team for doing that too. So that is the end of what I have to say about transition. I'm happy to take questions when we're done. Let me stop sharing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I have a lot of admiration for you. I had a renovation 2 years ago on the first floor, but we still had access to the second and third and didn't have to move any collections. So I feel your pain. And it's interesting to see the connections between you and Andrew about involving everyone and having to work out all these teeny tiny processes. But I also like what you said, sometimes you have to step away from the weeds. I find frequently with my staff, they get stuck in the weeds and you're like, is this really impacting anyone important like students? So thank you for those lessons. We're going to take questions at the end. I won't forget your questions. If you have questions in the meantime, please throw them in the chat. Our final speaker is Samuel Boss. He is the director of the new Northern Vermont University Libraries, and he's going to talk about weathering change, the library merger.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Can you hear me? So I'll just jump right into it. Just over a year ago, prior to July 1st, 2018, the Johnson State College and Linden State College communities were informed by the Office of the Chancellor that after much planning, that the colleges would merge to form Northern Vermont University. After extensive planning and work on the part of many of the staff members, faculty members, and administrators at both institutions, the colleges were essentially unified on 7/1/2018. As for the libraries, planning and execution began approximately 1 year prior to the date of unification. It all started with a proposal that touched on each of the functional areas of the library and all of our services. That proposal was hatched on a car ride in about 50 minutes between Johnson and Linden, and I was lucky to get it down on a piece of paper. The challenge that we faced was, how do we merge two geographically separated libraries with two very distinct cultures, serving two distinct communities, and unfortunately, no expectation for an increase in budget or additional staff lines. So getting started, I submitted the proposal to the administration for review during the summer of 2017. Feedback was very limited, and I think that was a good thing, and oftentimes not such a great thing, but we worked with it. To compound the complexity, and just to back up a step, Linden State College and Johnson State College, what is now Northern Vermont University, is part of the Vermont State College system. So we have additional sister libraries and sister colleges. So to add to the complexity of the merger situation, throughout that year, during the year of execution of our plans, sounds kind of weird, each library staff member from each library contributed to the selection and subsequent implementation of a new integrated library system, a new interlibrary loan system, and we moved from hosted proxy, locally hosted proxy to hosted proxy with OCLC. So that really isn't part of the merger. It played a role, but it's just to sort of paint the picture a little bit clearer. During the year of the merger, we implemented most of the items from the proposal, and I'll go through briefly each item, and I'll start with those that demanded the most of our attention. Obviously, staffing and responsibilities. The big question was, how can we develop new positions to meet new needs with our current staff? And of course, those new needs sort of existed before the merger even took place, but their importance certainly increased as we started serving different communities of students, those students that are online, those face-to-face, working with faculty that are in Australia and faculty that are down the street in Vermont. So we had a whole different set of challenges we had to work with, and how could we use our existing expertise to meet those needs? As far as staffing was concerned, the major challenges that we ran into were HR and union timetables for reviewing position descriptions. Of course, the availability of funds for salary increases for those individuals that were taking on additional responsibilities. And one of the biggest items we had to deal with was the varying levels of expertise that we had within our existing staff pool regarding certain functional areas. And this was especially a challenge in areas where we really needed growth in as far as instruction is concerned and electronic resources management. Budgeting. We had two separate budgets that had been structured and administered very differently for a very long time. And the highest levels of the money managers for this institution still see them as different documents. We've had to combine them. So when we spend money, it's equitable. Both sides are getting the same thing. Websites and web services, and I guess I shouldn't be using the word websites as a plural here. We had bounced back and forth a number of times on how we wanted to present ourselves virtually. It came down to how we decided to move forward with our electronic resources and our electronic resource platforms. Did we want to have 2 links for everything? Did we really need to have 2 search boxes, 2 websites? So we bounced back and forth a lot, but eventually decided that it was a much better idea to have a single website. But the implications were sort of far-reaching there, and we were doing a little cleanup and dealing with that for quite a while. Electronic resources, while it wasn't the most challenging of these aspects, it was certainly the item that took us the longest to sort out. So we had to renegotiate every single one of our contracts and subscriptions. We had to decide what we had to keep, what we had to drop, what we wanted, and what we could possibly add if there was going to be any savings. And this, of course, resulted in long, drawn-out discussions with staff members and librarians, and then, of course, with vendors. We eventually landed in a place where we felt we were offering a fair amount of resources to the community. We're still doing some work, doing some cleanup. We've had some complaints, but actually I was a little bit heartened to get the complaints because I now know that people are paying attention, and that's always a good thing. So we'll probably continue working on that at the end of this current fiscal year. And similar to the websites piece, we discovered that the electronic resources piece had larger implications for Interlibrary Loan, our OCLC identity, and certainly, as I mentioned, our web services. Now, Interlibrary Loan. I thought this was just going to be sort of a simple process. Everybody was going to be okay. The Interlibrary Loan coordinators would go on with life doing what they normally do. But once we started getting into how we were going to be identified by OCLC, as far as our OCLC symbol is concerned, are we going to have 1? Are we going to have 2? We're separated by about 50 miles on a state highway in Vermont. Not very easy to navigate. So this piece became fairly complicated once we had to deal with that. We resolved to maintain separate OCLC identities, but then we had to determine how are we going to use a single website, a single instance of EDS with 2 OCLC symbols. How is Interlibrary Loan going to work with that? So that was a big discussion. Information literacy education wasn't a big part of the planning and merger year. In fact, we basically exported the current program that we have at Linden. I'm currently on the, I'm director of both libraries, but I'm currently at my Linden office. So when I say import, or when I say export, I'm talking about things going from Linden over to Johnson. So we basically exported our IL program, and that was certainly the easy part. The difficult part we're dealing with now is building relationships with faculty, making sure that they're aware of what our services are, and they can trust us. We have their best needs in mind, and so on and so forth. So this is certainly an ongoing process. Acquisitions was one of our successes. We were able to get through the union, administrative, and financial hurdles and HR hurdles to get a position redesigned. So we have a single acquisitions person now, and she's handling all of those processes for both campuses, and she's done an excellent job of aligning our budgets, which was, as I mentioned before, a challenge. Throughout this entire merger year process, we realigned all of our library policies, and that was sort of on an ad hoc basis, and that just as all of these pieces involved every single staff member along the way. Now, as far as results are concerned, on July 1st, 2018, we had completely merged all of our electronic resources and subscriptions. We had a single website that was ready to go. We had implemented a single instance of EDS, EBSCO Discovery Service. We had launched our Coordinated Information Literacy Program. We piloted an assessment program here at Linden this fall, and we're going to bring that over to Johnson in the spring. As I mentioned, we have the new acquisitions position. We established a single service point information desk that was also a Linden import at the Johnson Library. And we were lucky enough to have redesigned our ILL workflows. We had a lot of help from OCLC, EBSCO, and Bywater, who we get our hosted Koha catalog from. And as of December of last year, we completed our strategic plan for 2019-2024, and that's been submitted to the academic infrastructure faculty committees on both campuses for review. So the challenges were certainly personnel, getting new positions created. We had the one success with acquisitions, but we certainly need more in the realms of instruction and electronic resources. And this is something that we continue to work on. In some cases, implementing programs that have been successful on one site to the other has been a challenge, because really that is, it starts to get into the areas, the neighborhoods of culture and building relationships. So that takes a lot more time. And really becoming a cohesive unit with respect to our institutional cultures is something that's ongoing. Throughout the entire process, working with staff and administration and third partners, every step of the way has been critical. We've had to nurse our relationships at times, but that extra attention makes all the difference. Like the others have mentioned, developing a clear plan that you know is going to be destroyed and stepped on and reconstructed and deconstructed on various occasions, and being okay with that is absolutely critical. And there were a number of individuals who served as confidants and consultants and friends throughout this entire process. And I'm sure they are happy to not have my phone calls and emails on a daily or weekly basis now, but having those people there at your side to help you work through something like this is certainly important. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
I can echo your sentiments about having someone else to talk to sometimes when you were a director. And I also hope that someone, I don't know, let you have your own meditation sleep time, because just listening to that virtual just tires me out. There's a lot of pieces and parts. So we have come to the part of this discussion where hopefully it's an actual discussion. We have prepared questions. I don't see, unless I'm missing stuff in here, any questions in the chat. So please enter any questions you have in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and ask one of our prepared questions, but if something came up that you definitely want to ask, like, Sam, how in the world did you get through all that in just a year? Or Amy, how are you surviving in your temporary space? Or Andrew, what other books do you have to recommend? I think every librarian should recommend a book, right? Of course a book should be in this presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to let whoever wants to jump in. A lot of you talked about how people were an important part of change. And as many of us have known, some people love change, but many do not. Thus the zombie processes. So what strategies for all of you that you didn't already mention do you find work best when you find someone that is resistant to a particular change you're about to make?
I'd be happy to chime in here quickly. We used a couple different strategies for dealing with change related to a particular or a group of staff members. One of the things I thought was very helpful was certainly involving a particular staff member in the change process, letting that staff member make suggestions. Of course, or not letting that staff member make suggestions, but working with that staff member on their suggestions. Asking that person what they want to see for their position. And of course, at times you're going to hit a wall. So when we struck walls, one of the things that we did was try to use our strategic planning process for implementing changes that were perhaps unpopular. And we backed that up with evidence for why we needed to do it and how we were going to do it and how it would affect a particular position. But certainly working with the staff member at the outset is the more desirable path to take.
I can speak to a little bit at Kenyon. You know, when we started this process and we knew a new library was inevitable, you know, they were working towards getting the funding from this donor. And, you know, the people that were on our early part of our logistics teams, not just in the library, but across, you know, in our IT organizations and other places, were often those that we knew needed more time to adjust to change. So if they were involved heavily in thinking about, you know, who's going to go where and how are these different things going to work, it helped them get that time they needed. But we also stopped about a little over a year and a half ago and worked, I think, for about 2 days together on a vision and a strategic direction to help them sort of see beyond this temporary space and start to feel like, what is it going to be like in this new building? So like Sam, we did a lot of that strategic planning to help, you know, getting people comfortable with that, yes, things will change, but many things can be comforting and the same. And so you had sort of different goals to work for while dealing with incredible change.
The other thing I'll add to all of that, what's been said so far, is also acknowledging to the staff person that they will have a job on the other side of the change. Because I think I found that a lot, both at Defiance and at Findlay, that when talking to about, again, workflow changes or even making changes to people's jobs, because I've done that too, that they're afraid they're going to lose their job. And again, I understand why, because they have bills, they need insurance. I get it, because I have the same situation. So it's just acknowledging that up front, that we're making this change, but we're making for a good reason, and don't worry, you're going to have a job on either side of it. It may not be the same one, but you're still going to be doing work and still get a paycheck.
Thank you all. I think it was interesting to see that a lot of you mentioned strategic plan. I think most people, when you say those words, their eyes glaze over. But I feel like making that vision and strategic plan is really important, and involving staff members, and that kind of helps them see you're not just making change for change's sake too. I see we got some questions in our chat, and I don't know if all the panelists can see them also. I'm just going to start from the top. So someone has asked, besides those in the library, who were your strongest supporters on campus? And then how did you align their needs and concerns despite their encouragement? I think that's right. How did you align with their needs and or concerns despite their encouragement?
I'll jump in on this. As I mentioned earlier, the feedback from our administration was limited at first, but as we started rolling these processes out and implementing some of our plans, we noticed that people would sort of come out of the woodwork with support, suggestions. We are part of a learning commons here on the Linden campus, so a lot of what we were doing affected how their operations. So we worked pretty closely and we received some help and suggestions from those folks in the Writing Center, Career Services, Academic Support Services. I serve on a number of faculty committees with the academic faculty, and in our discussions with how our changes would affect access to materials, both digitally and in print and instruction, they sort of really helped out in helping us plan and move forward. So each sort of box that we checked, we found that a different community or constituency, as it were, would sort of offer their expertise or suggestions or help.
Anyone else want to jump in? Okay. Let's see. I think this is for Amy and Andrew. It said, I would be interested in the switch from business consulting to libraries, and specifically, do either of those panelists have an MLS? And I did not know that both Amy and Andrew have backgrounds in business consulting, so I also am curious to know the answer to this question.
So for me, I think Andrew even mentioned, I worked in the research group. So I worked in an insurance company as a library director. I have an MLS. So I was in the research arm of the consulting group before here. So I hope that answers your question. But yes, I have an MLS.
So when I was working at Deloitte, I did not have an MLS. I actually just had my undergraduate degree. I was working with people that had an MLS. And again, it was in a knowledge management business development group that was dispersed in not just the United States, but also globally. My role did not at that time require an MLS, but I actually did obtain one while I was in Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh. And I have one now, of course, being an academic librarian.
I never knew that was another way to become a librarian. I thought English degree was like the default, which is what I have. There's another question here just for Amy. Was there ever any discussion about closing stacks during construction and relying just heavily on interlibrary loan?
We did talk about it, and for us, it would have been more on our consortial group as well as Ohio Link, so it wouldn't have been completely interlibrary loan. But it was 2 years, and we figured that would be just too complex, too hard, and it was easier to create an OpenStax and create a way to do it. And it gave some student jobs too, so I think it was a win-win for all of us. Took a lot of figuring out, but we were able to do it. So depending on, I see this is from Toby Peterson, right? Depending on where you are consortially, if you have good, like in Ohio Link, then it might not be so bad, but I don't know if I would do just ILL.
The next question is, were your deans and or provosts the strongest proponents of renovations and space design changes? Interesting question.
Hey. I'll go. So for Finley, the VPAA was a proponent for change, but also the faculty library committee. And again, that is the specific committee that's made of faculty, not the librarians. They were the ones who really were driving the change along with the VPAA when I arrived, saying that you need to do a renovation to make the library more, bring it up to date, make it more comfortable, more appealing, make it so people want to be there. So is the faculty also helping to push it?
So at Kenyon, I report to the Vice President of Library and Information Services, but the Provost was certainly heavily involved in the process of thinking about the new library, in part because some of the groups that we mentioned that were already in the library, the Center for Innovative Pedagogy, the Writing Center, and Student Support and Accessibility were in the library. They'll be coming back in, as well as career development, academic advising, and the registrar into our new space. So it's going to be a very academic, student success focused center when we're done. Today we're all over the place, so I can't say that we're frustrated with our lack of student focus right now, but.
I will just say, I think we're lucky in smaller colleges that the library is still considered kind of a community space. And so often administration wants to put money into that community space because it's good for retention. All right. Oh, here's a great question. I wish I had the answer to this one. How do you anticipate change? This person writes, the beginning of my year, I constantly felt sabotaged by change. Yes, my first year as director, I felt like that too. I'm working now. I'm trying to be ahead of the change, but what are some strategies to do that?
Is the question like change that happens to your group? I guess that's what it's a change you don't. Okay.
That's what I assume.
I think that's where good communication strategies with whoever, if that's coming from your provost's office or some other group. I mean, for us this year, like with all our temporary spaces, there are things that impact, I was just, thinking of change. they decided to, change the hours of some of the smaller college buildings, like where the history department, little places where the students would study. They suddenly changed the hours, and then the students are complaining there's not enough study space. And it's like, this is a change that we didn't have control over. So I understand the question, and trying to figure out how do you anticipate that coming and what the impact will be is really a tricky one. And I don't know that I have any good wisdom on that. Anyone else have?
If I could jump in, I think maybe anticipate is what makes this question a little challenging to answer, because some things just come out of the blue. You don't see them coming. We lost the computer lab, our primary instruction space, with very little warning. And of course, we've dealt with a number of other things that were unexpected changes. And certainly, even if I had planned to make accommodations for those changes, it still would have been a major disruption. So I think I hate to say, be reactive, or it's all in the reaction, but really it is in how you deal with the change that after it occurs. We lost the computer lab, as I mentioned, and that was a source of anger and frustration for me for about a year. But good things came out of it. I realized that I could take our resources into other classrooms and be just as effective in a library instruction session than I could in our computer lab. So it gets me out. So really, to me, it's all in the reaction and how you cultivate the sort of what you have left after that change. Because change is, as somebody noted down the line, change is constant. It's not going to go away. And as that person noted, and I'll agree with, it's a good thing, I think.
I think, as thinking of what Sam was saying, and one of the things to think about is trying to be as proactive as you can, so that you can get ahead of things yourself. You're not going to anticipate other people's decisions, but once they make them, if you can figure out what your next move is kind of quicker than, instead of saying, oh, I'm a victim, I'm, sabotaged, maybe think of, well, how do I turn that around and be proactive in some other way. I know that's not always easy to do.
Do you want to add anything, Andrew?
No.
There's a question just for Amy. Are all your non-library departments coming back to the new building?
Oh, that is a good question. One group has a lovely new Google-esque space. Our information technology services has got a nice space over the bookstore in the middle of the campus. So they're actually going to stay there, but everyone else will be coming back.
All right. This next question looks rather difficult. What strategies do you use to deal with individuals who agree to change and support the change, but in the background sabotage or derail any efforts at change?
Yeah, I think we've probably all been there.
Yes.
And what I've found, at least again, what I've done, it seems to work, is if you give that person the main responsibility to implement the change and hold them accountable, it will happen. They may not like it, but it will happen. That's, again, it's again, still applying gentle pressure and encouragement to make the change. Because sometimes, again, I think somebody mentioned this, is that sometimes it's there's a new skill set involved, or at least there's a discomfort with maybe not knowing how to do something or an aspect of it, and again, giving the person the training or support necessary too, but allowing them to learn and implement the change at the time. I think has worked for me.
I certainly echo Andrew there. Applying pressure, working with that individual. Accountability, of course, is very important. So whether the staff member likes it or not, regular communication, regular face-to-face meetings. And I think probably the hardest part, if you're non-confrontational, is generating the internal courage to have those discussions on a regular basis. That's a challenge for me, is I know that something needs to happen, but I don't always want to have that conversation. But of course, the change is not going to happen unless you have that conversation.
I'm thinking now, I think because this is sort of different, when you think about all the different kinds of ways change happens, right? And so I've been through the kinds of change that Andrew's dealing with. I've not done quite we've never merged a group in the way Sam has done, but I worked in a merged library IT, and as well as a combined unit with another university early on in my career here at Kenyon. I think that there's so many ways you can you can say, oh yeah, I'm making that change, and then just not do it. And so, that continued pressure, but the more they see others enjoying success by making those changes and moving forward in their careers, kind of go, well, wait, why am I holding myself back by not, being willing to do things? And so some of those questions, even when you're hiring, is, how do you deal with change? Is a good, sometimes just even asking up front, so that what people can anticipate and be proactive about that.
We have kind of a last question here. Maybe this is a good one to end on. How do we keep from overcomplicating change? If we keep telling people change is hard, is that setting up a negative mindset? I guess maybe you could just give me, all of you, your kind of last thoughts about change management.
For me, I think it's giving people the tools they need to make adjustments for themselves and be part of the planning process, whatever that change is. And I'm not going to I hate the word empowerment. I've been told that's a terrible word, but if you give them the tools and the ability to think for them, to do the work for themselves, that they'll surprise you.
I like that you've noted changes. Well, actually, you say they will inevitably change. I think maybe I could say that change is inevitable and change is job security. I think those are two important points that are made on that question. But how do we keep from overcomplicating change? Simply by recognizing that it is inevitable, I think. And generally, I guess, in my case, or in the case of NVU libraries, change is a good thing. We need to grow. We need to change. We need to meet the needs of our students and faculty and our staff members, our communities at large. The way they access information is not the way they accessed information a year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and we need to grow with them. So personally, I'm looking at this as a positive. I'm looking forward to growth. Most of the staff members, if not all of the staff members, actually all of the staff members are aware that this is a situation where they're dealing with, and 9 times out of 10, they're mostly on board with meeting our patrons, our communities, where they are right now.
I guess the only thing I would add on to that is just, again, acknowledging that people are people, they're human. And if you encourage, empower, again, not whatever the word we want to use, give them the tools, but also say that whatever the end result is going to make you a better person. And also, hopefully, we're delivering better services, which again is just reiterating what the other two have said.
I want to thank our 3 panelists, Amy Bodicher, Andrew Whitis, and Sammy Boss. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and trials and tribulations with change management at your organizations. And then also, I just want to point out, Debbie was very nice and has thrown in our assessment link in there. So we appreciate any feedback about this session. Liked it, hated it. We will be thinking about it for the future. So any positive or negative feedback we would appreciate. And thank you all for joining us today. And I hope it's much warmer and nicer wherever you are, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Andrew and Sam.
Thank you.